So I'm delighted today to be sort of prompting a conversation between us all. We're going to talk for about 40 minutes or so, and then we're going to open up to questions. So do have a think about what you might want to ask Ian and Sara and maybe myself as we chat. So my first sort of kind of question to both of you was, we are here to celebrate the Makars court, so it seemed fitting to ask you what writers, both Scottish and beyond, have had the greatest influence on you as a writer, as a human being? Mm. So I don't know, should we ask who wants to ask?
That's a big question.
Well,
no messing around this morning. I suppose for me, there's lots of writers that have had quite a big effect, some of them personal effects as well. T.C. Boyle, for me, wrote a book. He's an American short story writer and novelist, and he wrote a book called Water Music. It was his first novel, and it's just the most rambunctious, fantastic evocation of the Georgian world. And I remember reading it and laughing and feeling really emotionally engaged, crying, being afraid. And it's basically the story of Mungo Park, who was a Scottish explorer and adventurer. We sort of specialised in that in the late Georgian, early Victorian. And Mungo went off to map the Niger twice, didn't return from his second mission. And Boyle just brought it alive. You were there. You were in stinking London. You were in the middle of the Niger, and I loved it. So I suppose he would have to be certainly one of the ones that I would pick. And they brought him to the Edinburgh Book Festival it must be about 5 or 6 years ago. And I sat in the front row like a wee kind of groupie. I was like, oh my God, it's T.C. Boyle. And afterwards I hugged Nick, the festival director, and said, thank you for bringing T.C. Boyle. And Nick's not the kind of guy that you generally hug. So I think it was quite like, oh, right, okay. And yeah, so that's, I suppose T.C. Boyle would be the one that I would pick. But there's a lot of writers, Scottish writers. I think the best short story writer I've ever read is a woman called Lorna Moon, and she wrote a book called Doorways in Dromarty, which is actually stricken. When the book came out, it got banned from Stricken Library, even though it wasn't supposed to be about Stricken at all, but it was all about Stricken. And she's writing in the 20s, I think, probably maybe the very late teens, 1918 to say 1920 something. And she just modulates the story in the most tiny ways. It's really, really skilled. She's a fantastic writer. And I find that really inspirational from a sort of craft point of view. And also her life. She left Stricken, she went to Canada, then she ended up in Hollywood and ended up as a screenwriter, one of the very early silent movie screenwriters. She had an affair with Cecil B. DeMille's brother and had an illegitimate child, and then died quite young from TB. And she's lost. Mm-hmm. You know, nobody's ever heard of Lorna Moon. So I would pick her as well.
Well, okay.
What about you? You tell us.
Twice you said T.C. Boyle. I think you said Katie Boyle. I don't remember her writing anything, but T.C. Boyle. Yeah. I've not read them. Maybe I will now.
Try Water Music. It's a cracker.
Mungo Park. Is it apocryphal? The one story I know about Mungo Park is that he went into the jungle, as it were, into the dark of Africa with a retinue of sort of lots of trunks and lots of bearers and everything. And he came out 4 years later naked apart from a top hat.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay.
It's that. I mean, what a great story. That should be on the back.
Yeah, I sort of feel he maybe went to Vegas and just lost everything. I don't know. Influences. Well, it's funny. I mean, funny to have Ian Rankin Smith mentioned so early on. I don't know if he was a huge influence, but he was certainly an early influence when I thought I was going to be a short story writer. I thought I was destined to be a short story writer. And Ian Rankin Smith wrote these wonderful short stories. And one of the first successes I had with a short story was coming runner-up in a competition run by the Scotsman and Sinclair Computers. And the winner was Ian Rankin Smith. He got cold hard cash. And as a runner-up, I got a Sinclair Spectrum.
Sad times.
But I did get my story published in the Scotsman, and they did then pay me. So I was actually quite happy about it. And so he and I then became friends. He would write letters from Tainault, and I would write back from London, where I was living at the time. And one more story. He was getting a big prize, again, money. And it was done in London, and he said, Ian, can I come and stay with you? Well, we had this tiny wee flat in Tottenham. I said, yeah, come and stay with us. So I met him in central London. We went to this event, and it was all the great and the good were there. And I said, I think that's P.D. James over there. And he wandered over and went to the wrong woman, a children's writer, and introduced himself as a huge fan of this children's writer's work. And then we sort of got that confusion all sorted. And then we got on the tube to go back to Tottenham. And after 20 minutes, Ian Rankin Smith turned to me and he said, are we still in London? And I said, yeah, we've got about another 20 minutes to go before we get to Tottenham. And it just was like this. I mean, he was in his 60s by then, maybe getting on for 70. And it was like this was a great adventure for him to be there. But he was a wonderful writer and a wonderful poet and a novelist. Influences, I mean, you know, who knows what the influences are.
Yeah,
when I was a kid, I read Alistair MacLean novels. So I got this sense that adventure stories was what I was keen on. When I came to university, I ended up doing a PhD on Muriel Spark. I doubt you would easily see the influence of Muriel Spark in my work, but I think it's there. You know, and she has written one of the creepiest, weirdest crime novels ever, The Driver's Seat. A tiny wee 80-page novel which was made into a terrible, terrible film with Elizabeth Taylor and Andy Warhol, amongst others.
Wow.
But yeah, so everything. I mean, you as a writer, I guess everybody's an influence.
It's almost a problem. I don't know if you guys do this as well, but when I'm writing fiction, I can't read fiction because I'm a sponge. And so what I end up doing is taking people's, you know, their narrative voice just seeps into my narrative voice, and suddenly you sound like this other person. And so I now only read it when I'm not writing fiction, so it's in between books, and it's like a dieter that can suddenly get donuts. I'm like book a day, can't get enough of it in between, and I can only read non-fiction then when I'm actually writing. Sad times. Who's yours?
Mine?
Yeah.
Well, I was thinking when you were talking about short story writers, was thinking about Janice Galloway, who I think is just, and actually, I think the trick is to keep breathing. Her first novel probably gave me some sense of permission to write, or to think there was a place for what I wanted to write, what I wanted to write about. And then, Jackie Kay would be another huge influence.
She's
on Liz
amazing.
Lockhead. And so, yeah, but I know what you mean about it's hard to sort of, it's the kind of question you get asked quite a lot, what your influences are, which is, of course, why I asked you to begin with. But it is quite a difficult question, because sometimes it's, I'm quite influenced by music or art or visual art. It's very difficult to think about one particular what that, but I also think you always kind of go back to that first love, that first thing that you fell in love with, I think, don't you?
Yeah, totally.
I did an event last night with Damien Barr elsewhere in the city, and he brought up Liz Lockhead, and he said we studied a Liz Lockhead poem at school, and because he'd studied her at school, he thought she must be dead.
Imagine his surprise.
And then he was at an event or something, and he said, "Who's that over there?" And I went, "That's Liz Lockhead." And I went, "Thought she was dead." First time when he got that you could study living writers in school as well as long dead ones.
Yeah, absolutely.
That poetry thing, though, is really, like, for me even now, the books nearest to my desk in my study are poetry books, because they're palate cleansers. When your brain is tired, you get just a shot of poetry and you're like, oh yeah. Order.
Yeah, I was just thinking it was because as a poet that I often go to fiction or to essays when I'm writing poetry for the same reason. If I read too much poetry, I end up becoming a mimic rather than quite hard to find that sort of. So I was let's move on. So one of the things I was thinking about, which is sort of a similar question in the sense that we're here to celebrate the Makars Court, and there's particular writers in that Makars Court, and I don't know if you know all of them, but is there maybe one that you want to particularly highlight to our audience, or is there maybe a writer you think that should be there that isn't, or you would nominate to be part of the Makars Court?
I have a list of about at least a dozen women that should be in the Makars.
Well, let's go for it.
Okay. Well, Lorna Moon, for a start. Yeah. Mary Maitland, the first lesbian love poetry since Sappho, medieval poet, whose work's just generally completely ignored, and also wrote partly in Scots. Who else would we put in there? Ray Tannehill, amazing food and sex historical writer. Helen McInnes wrote 21 espionage classics. Her books were so accurate they used them to train SAS operatives during World War II. Wow.
What was her name again? Sorry.
Helen McInnes.
Helen McInnes.
Mary Brunton, who wrote, it's almost like dirty Jane Austen. Contemporaneous with Jane Austen, she's buried in the Canongate. Susan Ferrier, Sir Walter Scott said Susan Ferrier was a better writer than he was. He was not wrong. Also an Edinburgh-based writer. I mean, there's a massive "Where Are the Women?" I wrote a whole book because "Where Are the Women?" And their stories generally get lost. And so, I do feel like when I look down at it, I do feel like there's just a lot of people missing in action. Joanna Baillie, the preeminent dramatist of the early Georgian world, a huge inspiration to Harriet Martineau, huge inspiration to Byron, massively successful in her day, not on Makars Court, like where is she? So there's a lot of people missing in action, I feel, there, particularly women. I'm sure there are guys missing as well, though.
Well, there's only room for so many names, I suppose, and they've made a good start, but there's plenty more flagstones.
Yes, do a little circle of women around the edge of the old guy.
One of my favourite writers, and I guess a big influence on the Rebus novels, is inside the Writers' Museum, and that's Robert Louis Stevenson. And I've always been a huge fan of Steve. I'm very excited because next February, March, I'm going to go to Samoa and hopefully see where he's buried, see where Tusitala sort of ended up. And I just love that when you go into the Writers' Museum, you go into the Robert Louis Stevenson room, there is the wardrobe that was in his bedroom when he was a kid, that had been crafted by Brodie, Deacon William Brodie, who was gentleman by day and thief by night, who was a Jekyll and Hyde character, and who was eventually hanged on a gibbet that he had crafted himself, or partly crafted himself as a carpenter. So, you know, he would, Brodie, as a lot of you will know, he would sort of gentleman by day, well respected, but by night, because he'd made the keys for your flat, it was very easy for him to break in with his gang and steal your valuables and hit you over the head. And I, you know, so that kind of Jekyll and Hyde thing, that when I first came to Edinburgh, that Jekyll and Hyde Edinburgh was there in front of me in the 1980s. It didn't seem to have moved on very far. The old fur coat and the knickers. Just below the surface of Edinburgh, all kinds of terrible things could be going on, and we wouldn't know anything about it. It was a city that held its secrets very close to its chest. So yeah, he was a huge influence. And I remember one time I went into the Writers' Museum, and they unlocked the wardrobe for me so I could look inside it. Kind of like a desk type thing, not really a wardrobe, but anyway. And the story of Deacon Brodie is written inside it. And so I just love all that. And I just thought he was an extraordinary character. He was an extraordinary character. Like a lot of Scottish authors, he felt the need to get away. I mean, Muriel Spark did it a bit later on, but there was this notion that you had to get away from Scotland to become yourself or to become a writer. And so Edinburgh and Scotland for a long time sort of disdained Robert Louis Stevenson, I think, and preferred Scott because Scott stuck around and paid off his debts by writing himself into an early grave. So Scott became the kind of preeminent writer, whereas Stevenson's a much better writer, I think. Like you were saying about Walter Scott. There's plenty of writers out there who are better than Sir Walter Scott, but he got all the plaudits at the time, and he got this lovely spaceship put up to him, which is an extraordinary thing. By public subscription, I believe.
Also missing in action, Stevenson's second cousin, D.E. Stevenson, Dorothy Stevenson. She sold a lot more books than Robert Louis, just saying. She sold 40 million copies of her books in her lifetime and lived in the West End. No one's ever heard of D.E. Stevenson. Her stuff is in the museum in Muffet. I keep trying to go to the museum in Muffet, but it only opens for 2 hours on certain days. And every time I'm going through Muffet, I miss the museum in Muffet. But I'd love to see what they've got of hers. So yeah, it's an extraordinary family, the Stevensons.
That's the Scott fans gathering outside.
Yes. Don't you just wish?
I think they're shouting names of writers we've missed.
That's probably it.
I think they're going to come in and defenestrate us.
It's interesting that when we, you know, I suppose there's something that's almost slightly problematic about celebrating writers from one country and saying something about it. But we are, I suppose, by doing that, saying there's something maybe perhaps distinct. And I wondered whether you thought there was something distinct about Scottish writers, or is there common themes or common threads, or, you know, is there something that we're more preoccupied with, or is that?
I think we're a country with 3 languages, and I think even we always have really been that, and so you have a lot more vocabulary. I grew up in a house where there were a lot of different languages, so we had Russian, Yiddish, English, French, like that was commonly spoken, a bit of Scots as well, all around us all the time. And it does mark up your interest in vocabulary. It opens your mind to the way you might describe the same thing differently. And so I think that is very distinct in Scottish writing. Quite often you sometimes see it in Irish writing actually as well, because so many people do speak Gaelic and Irish in Ireland as well. You sometimes do see the influences of that in the narrative voices that people use. What is going on out there?
I think it might be the protest with the ceasefire, maybe.
Yeah.
Or it's the people in that massive big
screaming,
saying, "Please let me off." So what do you think about that? I mean, it's quite
Well, I mean, there's the old cliche of the Caledonian antisyzygy, of this notion of being where extremes meet, as McDermott once said. And I get a lot of that kind of tension in Scots. I mean, a lot of that dark and light, a lot of that where dark and light meet. So again, we're kind of back to Jekyll and Hyde.
I was thinking about,
or Justified Sinner, these early, very Gothic novels that were all about the meeting between the darker side of life and the more lighter side of life, and the temptation to go over to the dark side, as it were. So I find a lot of that certainly in Scottish literature, but then coming into the present, you get it in Muriel Spark as well. Miss Jean Brodie, is she the hero or the villain of that book? I mean, everybody's got a different opinion, and the more you read it, the more your opinion might actually change. It's a TARDIS of a book. It's much bigger on the inside than the outside. But all of that feeds into Scottish crime fiction then. And Scottish crime fiction, I think, has been very good at looking at the kind of the underbelly, the bits where the overworld and the underworld meet. And structurally, it's there in Edinburgh between the rational new town and the chaotic old town. So you've actually got a perfect city for writing crime fiction. I mean, Glasgow too, with the West End and the East End and everything else. I mean, all cities have got it, but it seems to me that in Edinburgh it's kind of almost built into the stones. And this notion of us having a sense of another world, so you do get a lot of kind of, you get Gothic writing, but you also get writing that involves the spirit world. You get ghosts and you get an interest in the supernatural. I think we're much more inclined, like Celts, we're much more inclined to believe in that other world than sort of the more rational Anglo-Saxon world.
That's interesting, that idea that we're kind of sitting on that thin place, isn't it? That kind of, and the idea about contradictions, I think that's something that feels that we quite enjoy exploding the good person who's kind of
But menace, there's something intrinsically quite menacing, I think. You know, that there's a big rise at the moment in Gothic fiction. You've got like Caroline Jess Cook in writing Gothic novels at the moment. Like, there's quite a few people who are writing that sort of fiction, and it has a real sense of menace. And of course, so much of what people write in the crime genre is all about menace. And so I think we do. It's almost like the weather, isn't it? It's just like quite menacing.
And that when you were talking about that kind of lyricism, and I think that for me, there always seems to be something, even if we don't speak Scots or write in Scots, I think we're always aware of the grammar of it or the song of it. And I think that always feels very present for me in kind of Scottish, that lovely twisting and turning. But I suppose the other question is, like, you're talking, I was going to ask this question later, but it feels like this might be the right moment, is you talk about the rise of the Gothic and what we're writing about now. And I always feel that one of the things that I've particularly enjoyed about the Rebus books is it feels like the crime's there, but also saying something about the society we live in. And they feel like they're really, and I think crime fiction at its best is always a reflection of, or saying something about society. And I feel like we're at the moment now, which what they call perma-crisis. Is that what we're living through at the moment? This period of absolute kind of permanent crisis, this endless crisis, these endless wars. And I wondered what you thought writers can offer in this kind of moment of turmoil, or, you know, what is our role?
Well, I mean, in the crime novel specifically, there seems to be two sort of schools at the moment that are successful. One is the cosy, what we used to call the cosy, the kind of comfortable novel, the novel of gifted amateurs who solve the crimes and bring order back out of chaos. So you've got your Richard Osman style book, which is very comforting. And a lot of people post-COVID, post-Brexit are looking for comfort. They're looking for a world that makes sense. And these novels give them a rational world, a world that makes sense, a world where good people will triumph over evil. Then you get the rise of the kind of, I don't know, is it called domestic noir? I don't know exactly what it's called, which are novels of paranoia, where you can't trust anybody. Your best friend is actually your worst enemy. Your partner is somebody you don't really know. Your next door neighbour is out to kill you. Your kids are out to kill you. You're being spied by all the technology. All the technology around you is spying on you. And people you think you know from the internet are not who they seem to be. So there's that sense that we're also in a very paranoid time when people don't know what to trust, they don't know who to trust. They certainly don't seem to be able to trust the news anymore. We're surrounded by fake news, by fake IDs, by people, people we think we know on the internet are not who we think they are. And people try to steal our identities, and we make it very easy for them to steal our identities. So the crime novel has always dealt with the fears of its contemporary audience. So that's a reflection of that. But there's also that retreat to a kind of comfort blanket that the kind of cozier side of the crime novel can bring.
And I suppose that's, I'll let you, sorry.
Yeah,
I mostly write historical, but I did write a historical crime series, but my interest was really the historic, not the crime. And it is an amateur detective. And for me, writing history is about looking at where we come from and why we're here. And so I've always been kind of drawn like a magnet to the rise of the British Empire and the fall of the British Empire, which is that late Georgian, early Victorian, and then mid-20th century. And those are the two areas that, put me in a museum, put me in an art gallery, put me in a library. I'll go to the stuff that came from those times or that refers to those times immediately. And that, for me, that's something that I just find fascinating, is going back in and looking at where we really come from, as opposed to perhaps where we might be taught that we come from or where we think we come from, and saying, well, actually, what was the right reality of that? Because largely it's a lot more diverse than we think it is, or we've been taught it is. And it's it's not as absolute as we have been taught it is. So when writing The Fair Botanist and looking at 1822, there's a whole load of people in 1822 who thought like the George IV visit was rubbish and hated George IV. Lots of women hated George IV. Jane Austen hated George IV. He was really awful to his wife, and a lot of women just didn't go with that. And when you read the history books, all you get is Sir Walter Scott and the whole city turns out and there's a massive party. And so it's being able to go back and look at the reality of where we come from, the flip side of that, and help perhaps explain or throw light in some way on where we are and perhaps where we might want to go. And for me, that's what brings me to historical. And I wrote a 9-book crime series by mistake because I was interested in the 50s. But the 50s seemed to me like a time it was such a seminal decade for the UK, because it started in the wake of World War II, and the country was extremely poor and everyone was depressed. People were really still grieving. A lot of people had lost people that they loved. And then you go through the 50s and you can just see Britain cheer up. and that's the journey that I wanted to go, and the means of it was by solving murders for me. So it's a totally different direction than, of course, where your books come from, which are much more, based in the crime and where society is now, whereas I'm much more interested in looking at why we're here, maybe, or where that comes from.
And I suppose it also offers the fact that I think sometimes we feel that there's no way out of the moment we're in, whereas actually history offers us much to understand that things can get better or change can happen. But I mean, for me, it feels like what fiction and what writers do is can offer nuance. We're living very much in a world where it's, we're almost forced to take positions all the time. And actually, I feel that what good fiction and maybe what writers can offer is the fact that to allow us to sit in the nuance and to sit in the kind of uncertainty. And I wonder if that is, but these ideas of what the role is or what our duty is, it's sort of...
Well, it also, it allows a lot of empathy. I forget that famous quote, but it's something to do with, if you don't read, you live only one life.
That's
but if you're a
James
reader,
Baldwin, isn't it?
You'll live thousands of lives, because you will get inside the heads of different people in different cultures and communities at different times in history, and you'll get a sense of what it would have been like to be them, or even in the future, what it would be like to live in the future. And that's one of the things I really love, is losing yourself in a book, that kind of cliche of just losing yourself in a book. The last great book that I lost myself in was a new Jilly Cooper novel, Tackle. She had to call it, it's about the football, right?
Okay.
She had to call it Tackle because she'd already used Score for a book about a randy conductor, and she called that Score, so she went with Tackle for this one. But this kind of world she creates, I think, is a very fine and rich world, and it's so make-believe that you can just jump into it like into a warm bath and lose yourself there for a few hours and just escape from escape from reality.
Yeah, it's about. I suppose a really good novel is a workout for your brain. It's like going to the gym. It's like, what if I looked at it from this side, or maybe if I looked at it from that side, and it just stretches you a little bit, I suppose. And if you're doing that on the regular, it is, there's no question, there's scientific data that it helps you in your problem-solving skills, helps you have empathy, helps with lots of things that we would all like to have.
And yet, growing up, I grew up in a house where my parents weren't really readers.
Me
so
too.
There were very few books in the house, but we had a lovely local library, a little Carnegie Library in Cardiff that I used to haunt. I would take as many books as they would let me. But I didn't have any sense of Scottish literature. At primary school, we had to learn a Burns poem. Yeah. The Burns Federation gave you a wee certificate for learning a Burns poem and a song and a general knowledge quiz on Burns, and you end up getting 3 certificates. And then in high school, I'm scratching my head.
How did you end up doing Muriel then?
I ended up doing Muriel because that was the only way I was going to get to stay at university for 3 more years. Genuinely. My undergraduate specialty was American literature, and I wanted to do a PhD on Thomas Pynchon, the American novelist. And I was told that I wouldn't get funding to go to a university in Scotland to do work on an American novelist. A guy called Cairns Craig told me that. He was a young lecturer at the university. He's now retired. That's how old I am. And he and I said, and the way he said it to me, I said, well, who would I get funding to do a PhD on? And he said, well, there's not much about Muriel Spark. And I said, what, Miss Jean Brodie, that woman? And he went, I said, I've seen the film. And he said, well, she's written 23 novels. I went, all right.
They're filming this, you know. Is this going in the big book of Castee-uppies?
I went off and I read her books, I did a proposal, and I got 3 years of funding to do Muriel Spark. And then immediately did as little as possible so they couldn't kick me out. But I had 3 years of funding to start becoming a writer myself. So I sat in the National Library of Scotland and wrote 3 novels.
Wow. And so, but did you fall in love with her stuff?
Yeah, I totally did.
Because you're a big fan
now.
now.
Yeah, and that thing you're talking about, you know, the T.C. Boyle, I mean, there's photographs of me meeting Muriel Spark the year before she died when she came to the Edinburgh Book Festival, did an event with Alan Taylor and did a reading from Miss Jean Brodie. And afterwards there was a party for her and I went along to that. I had 2 huge shopping bags of her first editions. But she was tired and she was unwell and she was tired, so I just plucked out Miss Jean Brodie and said, will you sign that? And the photographer got me sitting looking like fanboy. This big cheesy grin on my face. Muriel Spark signed my copy to Ian Rankin. And I just, it's up on my wall. It's in I've got 3 photographs and they're all on my office wall. She's next to Keith Richards. That's the only other writer. The only other writer that I've got framed photograph of me meeting is Keith Richards.
And what do you think you learned? Like, you know, you talk about Muriel Spark. Maybe interesting, just maybe just talk about her for a moment. And what does she? What is it that's so exciting about her writing? What's that so exciting to meet that as another writer, to meet her work?
Well, every book is completely different. No 2 books are the same.
Well, that's
she
quite
was
real
incredibly
freedom,
restless. She was incredibly experimental. So you would get on the back of her paperbacks, it would say sparkling and witty and comic. And when you actually dug into the book, it was horrible and dark and satirical, very, very darkly satirical. And she was sort of writing about the 70s. She was writing about the chaos of the 1970s in her best books. But she was also a poet, as you will know, Hannah. And so the books are incredibly short. Her best books are her shortest books. And she's an extraordinary economy. You know, Miss Jean Brodie was published originally as a single issue of The New Yorker.
Wow. I didn't know that.
And it was only when you got to the very end that you got her name. So you open up The New Yorker and page 3, it just says The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, and the story begins. And you get to the end of the magazine and there it says at the bottom by Muriel Spark. There was nothing else in the magazine, that issue. It's an extraordinary thing, 1960, 61, I think. So I just thought, I mean, she's got great economy, she's dark, she's satirical, she's very Scottish and hardly ever writes about Scotland.
That's interesting.
But there's a lot of Scottishness in her, in a way that again, a divided self. She was part Jewish, part Presbyterian, became a Catholic.
I feel like she never really found her identity, that her life was, and her writing was really a search for that kind of identity.
That restlessness.
Totally.
Yeah.
She fell out with my granny.
She fell out with your granny?
She fell out with my granny because my granny, she was brought up, Muriel was, I can't remember the number of Bruntsfield plays.
Yeah.
My granny lived further down the road and my granny's side of the family are Jewish. And so they knew the Cambergs. She was Muriel Camberg originally. And Muriel was very uncomfortable after the war when there were a lot of Jewish refugees coming out. She didn't want to be associated in any way with these poor, starving, terrible, like she just, and she writes great snobs, and I always wonder if that's why. She understood that discomfort, that so they had a ruck about it. They'd known each other. My granny's almost the same age, and they had a ruck about it. So
I'll tell you how much of a fanboy I am. Actually, when I was doing my PhD, I went to that flat. I went to the kind of indoor flat up in Bruntsfield, and I photographed the buzzers because one of them had Camberg on it.
Oh.
And I just took a photograph of the buzzers to have her name.
I want to get that photo of you.
Yeah, it's on my phone now. I've got it on my phone.
I want it.
I'll share it later.
Thank you.
Thanks to the miracle of modern technology. But I mean, she was ignored in Edinburgh for quite a long time because she left Scotland. And it was only on her centenary that they started to name a couple of streets after her and what have you, and re-released their books.
They're not even streets, though. Can I just climb on this hobby horse? I've got it right here ready. So this is one of the problems, I think, in Edinburgh, is that it's so static, it's so heritage bound, and we have a writer like Muriel Spark who's absolutely fantastic, and the only streets left to name after her is a wee path that crosses the meadows. And that's
the steps down to the mound.
The steps down to the grass market. And, our city is full of a past that leaves no room for the present, almost in a way, or there's no sense of shifting. And I'm just going to say I've moved to Glasgow. And it's not like that there. That's all I'm going to say.
Well, we could probably have a longer chat about
Yeah,
maybe
let's have
some
that
ways it
later.
is. But yeah, no, I think that that's really interesting about who we, and I suppose this idea about the Makars court is about we're choosing who we celebrate, we're choosing who gets commemorated. So there is a real kind of politics around that, and there's a real, we can really talk about diversity. I mean, one of the things I was thinking about this idea about where Scotland ends. I mean, if you think about somewhere like, for example, Jamaica, which has more Scottish surnames in the phone book than we have here, like, is there an argument to have, writers who share that sort of, that would come and be part of our Makars court? Like, what is it that makes... So I think there's some real interesting conversations that we can have, I think, maybe not today, but, that we can have about who in fact becomes the Scottish writer, and this idea that when you leave and who gets celebrated. Because I suppose part of what being a writer is about fighting back against... kind of establishment, and so there is a way that's odd then to be celebrated by the establishment, which maybe I'm wrong, but part of our role is to sort of push back, perhaps, or to offer something that maybe not.
I think there are two kinds of creatives. There's creatives who are conformist and creatives who are non-conformist, and you either run with what society's expecting of you, what your genre's expecting of you, what the thing is, and that doesn't make that person a bad writer. It doesn't make them uncreative. But there is a big split in the creative community between people who are conformist and people who are non-conformist. And there is an interesting battle, really. I think.
And I suppose then when we talk about who gets celebrated, is it which one of those?
Well, I think both do, actually.
Well, if you're a non-conformist, you don't want to be celebrated.
Well, maybe.
Because that would make you conformist.
Or maybe you just don't care, but you hope it happens.
But then I suppose the question is, are we celebrating the author or the people that read them and people that love them? And so then it's about, is celebrating or commemorating an author about maybe also what they represent and what they represent of the culture we're in. Do you know what I mean? Is it like less about them and more the people that then get omitted because their writer or their experience isn't being celebrated?
I mean, I do think there's, the Writers' Museum is a wonderful thing, but it's small, very compact and slightly claustrophobic, and it literally only has room for those three writers. It's got Scott, it's got Stevenson, it's got Burns. And you go, well, couldn't we have a rolling thing where you take them out and put three other writers in or something? It'd be lovely if it could celebrate different writers, because it seems like that's them in aspic. That's what you're saying about a museum piece. We've decided this is our...
the kind of fixed canon.
Yeah, the canon. Yeah, and we can't change it.
Yeah, and
it's why the stones outside are important, because we can add new names to them.
Yeah, but it's not the same as having, white men in aspic and ladies on the street. I mean, it's just not the same. It's not the same gravity. It doesn't have the same gravity and the same.
And I think there was a slightly missed opportunity as well with the Scottish Parliament. I mean, you'll all have walked past the Scottish Parliament down to Canongate, and on the walls are writers, pieces of writing by Scottish writers, but they're sort of, you can't see them. They're sort of, I don't know what it is. It's something about the stone or about the way they've been chiseled into the stone, or they're too high up or they're too low down. And so you pass them without actually noticing them.
There's hardly any women on there either, though. There are a couple, but there's hardly.
There's also a very narrow pavement, so from somebody who grew up in Edinburgh, going working on the Royal Mile, anyone stopping on the Royal Mile is a little bit of a hindrance. But yeah, they are this sort of. It's kind of. I mean, I suppose in some ways it's wonderful to have any sort of kind of writing within a kind of building like that. There's something probably to. Yeah, I think you're right. There's kind of.
There is more artwork inside that commemorates stuff as well. It's not only on the outside. If you go on the inside, there's a couple of walls that've got this huge ceramic installation of female writers, which is pretty extraordinary actually on the inside too. So yeah.
Well, that's. I think before we move on to asking you lot to kind of offer some questions. Sorry, trying to find a better way than you lot, but it just lost me. So, our wonderful audience. Sorry.
You should very quickly turn around and look at the light, because the light.
Yes. In fact, we should all turn around. We should not be on this side. Look at that.
I think.
How fantastic.
I know. I mean, after all the kind of horrible days we've had recently, it's just lovely to see a bit of light on the stone again.
That's it.
I think Rosa.
So I suppose the last question I had for you, I suppose, was who excites you about kind of contemporary Scottish literature? What's
spoken word poetry, I think, is so exciting. Yeah, there's a whole load of people that coalesce around some of the spoken word clubs, and I love it because it's subculture. and it's performance. I'm not a performer. I'm quite a good lecturer, but I'm a terrible performer. And just seeing people being able to not only write it, but also communicate it in that way is, I think, quite extraordinary. So for me, those people, I need to govern that crowd.
Yeah, I was going to mention Len Penny,
Oh, yeah.
who I guess falls into that category of being a performance poet who sort of made her name on Twitter when it was Twitter.
We've just got a book coming out with Canning
She's got a book coming out. Yep.
She's
called
extraordinary.
Poems.
Poems. Poems.
Yeah.
But she's very good. And yeah, all those kind of poetry slam nights that go on in clubs and things now, something that I'm way too old for. I'm in bed by 9 o'clock. But I mean, they are brilliant, and there's a whole new culture coming through from that.
Yeah, I feel that as well. I feel like it's almost like that thing that is poetry that replenishes my head, and also it's where the edge is now. I mean, I don't write at the edge really, but
it has a real crossover into Scottish theatre, I think. When we're talking about what's distinctly Scottish, I suppose what's interesting about spoken word and what's interesting about, I suppose what's distinctive about Scottish spoken word and Scottish theatre is it's incredibly political. And I think that's what, in terms of when you speak to people across the world about what they're excited about Scottish theatre, for example, it's always about the political nature of it. So I think there's a shared world there. That's
totally. Everything that Davy Gregg's doing at the Lyceum is extraordinary. It's really extraordinary. So, and beyond that as well, there's a lot of kind of workshopping stuff happening. And it's that crossover of talent between writing and performance and production. We have a lot of talent for that.
And I mean, I hate to bring Glasgow back into the equation, but Pine a Pint. Pine a Pint was a brilliant, a genius idea. Just going for 1 hour, you get a pie, you get a pint, you get an hour of theatre. It's new theatre.
And it's in the Traverse now.
It's at the Traverse too.
The Traverse,
The Oramore, the Play the Pie the Pint people do a very dirty panto. Apparently it's like an adult panto, and it's supposed to be utterly hilarious, totally political. And I've got tickets. I'm quite excited. I haven't been to the panto for years, and I'm going to go to the panto and see this kind of I suppose it's what vaudeville theatre would have been originally, almost like a real kind of the moment. So yeah, that's exciting stuff.
Oh, good. Okay, great. Shall we offer throw it out to
roving mic? She's excited.
Yeah, we have a roaming mic.
She wants the roving mic.
So you just have to raise your hand, and then someone will come
Rosa's got one over
you.
there.
Someone already. Oh, great.
Yeah, and so had we read Scots poetry?
What, Scots poetry?
Yeah, I haven't actually. I have to, yeah.
And now I probably won't, because I'll just go and read Byron.
Yeah. Because why would you?
It's funny, that thing about comparing and being competitive, isn't it?
But it's not even it's what's best for your brain. Somebody might read something and you think, oh my God, that's rubbish. And then someone else reads it and it sets them alike, because our brains work differently. We're interested in different things. We have different, it's just a different thing. So
the summer before I started at Edinburgh Uni, we got sent a reading list and said, this is the stuff you should read before you start your undergraduate degree. And I religiously went out and got all these books. And it was a roasting hot summer. It must have been June, July, 78. And I sat in the back step of our terraced house in Bow Hill, Cardendale, trying to read Scott. I try to read Scott's novels, and I just went, is this what I've got to do at uni? And I just thought, it was Waverley. I'm pretty sure it was Waverley was the one they gave us to read. And it really almost put me off.
Probably their intent. Maybe.
Well, the first 2 years at Edinburgh almost put me off, because it was Hardy and Wordsworth and Pope. Alexander Pope's poetry, dear God. And I just felt, this is so alien to me. None of this is saying anything to me or talking to me in any way. I nearly dropped out.
I did my degree was at Trinity in Dublin, so we did a lot of Irish authors. And it was exactly the opposite experience. I got there and I found a culture that was proud of itself almost in its difference. And so, reading Brendan Behan and Brendan Donnelly and all of these, and of course James Joyce, and I discovered, I suppose, an additional lexicon that tied in very much with my Scottish identity, and my initial reaction was fury that we didn't have that. Like, where was our Joyce? Why weren't we empowered to write that in the early 20th century? And Samuel Beckett, where were those people?
Well, I mean, during my time at Edinburgh as an undergraduate, which was 78 to 82, they did introduce a course you could do in Scottish literature for one semester. But they had to fight. I mean, the people behind it had to fight to get that into the curriculum against the old guard, I guess.
And who was on it?
That's a good question. Honestly, I mean, McDermott would have been there, I guess, but I forget who else would have been on it. It was Cairns Craig and a couple of other younger lecturers who started it, and people from the history department as well. But that eventually did grow and grow and grow. But also it tied in with the start of suddenly, it was, 78 to 82, we suddenly had Polygon books came about, and
through the university
was starting to do stuff, and James Kelman got published, and Alistair Gray, and Agnes Owens, and Liz Lochhead, of course, was there. And it was like there was a kind of new excitement about Scottish writing. There were small magazines growing up everywhere. Everybody seemed to be publishing a small magazine, poetry magazines and prose magazines and review magazines. And there was a real sense that something's happening here. And a lot of it was was around Canongate publishing Lanark. That had quite a lot to do with it.
I was thinking, because when I went to university, it was 97, 98. And I remember our first year we read Janice Galloway, we looked at Jackie Kay, we read Beloved by Toni Morrison. So my experience was like, oh my goodness, this is writing. Whereas before I remember being, studying, doing your higher English and stuff, like doing, I think we did, oh God, I can't remember. But I remember just going, right, okay, I can get through this, but suddenly going to university and wow, look at what's possible, these incredible, I was really excited by it. So it was interesting to, even in that 20
It's so important.
years,
That's why diversity is important, so that you engage everybody, because people's minds work differently. You're interested in different stuff, and you all know that because, you read different stuff from your pals, or your kids will read something and you think, what are they doing? But all they're doing is the same brain exercise.
But also that, we talk a lot about diversity in publishing. That's incredibly important. I often think about, what it must be like to read all the books that you ever read, you recognize the main character. Like you go, oh, that could be me. And to be someone like me who's mixed race and Scottish, who's never read anything until I got to Jackie Kay, that I went, oh, there's me. Whereas like always going, so this idea about imagination, always had to imagine myself into to people that are so, so different from me. And then I always thought, what must it be like to read books we don't have to do that huge amount of sort of imagination to say, what would it, So, I think there's something. So, it's interesting. Very off your question there, but, creative writing workshops, I think, and that accessibility is just so incredibly important. If you think about where Scottish literature is now, so much of that has begun in creative writing workshops and writing groups. And, so have you got any other questions? I should go.
I'm just going to check. Don't worry about me. You might have to just talk quite loudly.
Yeah, if you talk, then we can repeat your question. That might help everyone.
Yeah.
That's a question for you.
There's no plans at the moment to find a new writers' museum. I mean, obviously we're always looking at our museum service and evolving, a bit like Makars Court. What I would say is, though, we do have temporary exhibitions on at the Writers' Museum. So before COVID, we had a temporary exhibition on Muriel Sparks' work, and we had a J.K. Rowling first edition as well. So we are looking at the temporary education programme and education as well. Our outreach, we look at different contemporary authors, and obviously we are looking at diversity at the moment in everything we do in Edinburgh museums, and our education and outreach programme is really looking at that. And I know that Gillian Findlay, who is the curator of the Writers' Museum, is looking potentially at other exhibitions in the near future.
Yeah.
But you're right, a new brand spanking Writers' Museum where we're bringing in sort of women writers and far more diversity would be fantastic. We're very well aware of that.
There is a proposal actually to take part of John Knox's house above the Storytelling Centre. And that's tied in with the Edinburgh City of Literature, so it's part of their remit, and they're developing that. But I don't know if that is coming about, if it's being funded, or But there it has been talk around since before COVID, I think, of creating something there, which was perhaps the exhibition would be a bit more relevant, a bit more current, a bit more
It's interesting.
available.
The Writers' Museum is just such a fantastic visual feast, though. It's a very special spot, and it's much loved with both Edinburgh residents and international visitors love it as well.
And I think there's always something interesting about museums of what's missing. Like, I think sometimes noticing what's missing is almost as educational as having it there. Like, there's sometimes I often think those kind of exhibitions and museums that kind of provoke you to thinking, well, that's missing, or that's leading, that there's a richness in that as well. So, but yeah, maybe we should, but also just maybe we should, I think the whole of Edinburgh sometimes feels like a writer's museum, don't you? So, yeah.
I used to glibly say that. I'd say, people, if I did an event in America, that I would say, just imagine Edinburgh, you arrive at Waverley Station, named after a novel. There's not too many railway stations named after novels. And when you walk up, the first thing you see is a Scott monument, one of the largest monuments in the world to a writer. And as you walk around, you see plaques celebrating writers. A narrow range perhaps, but there is quite a lot of interest in Edinburgh which is why it became a city of literature, I guess. It was the first ever UNESCO World City of Literature, because we went to the UNESCO and said, we should be this. From publishing to writers, to being an influence on the world. Edinburgh's played a huge part.
Totally. It's still an Enlightenment city.
Well, I was thinking about the three of us as well. Like I would, especially the two of you, but argue that Edinburgh is a really strong character and presence in all of our work. And I think if it's one of those cities that you end up, even if you don't mean to, it just seeps into your sort of, into your writing or into your imagination and the way you perceive things. I think it's a kind of powerful city that way.
And it is, there are dozens upon dozens of writers, contemporary writers, writing about Edinburgh or setting their stuff in Edinburgh.
Absolutely.
And it's all different Edinburghs.
Yeah.
Every Edinburgh is slightly different from everybody else's Edinburgh. And I love that. Even with the crime novels, I go, but your crime novel's different from my crime novel.
Yeah.
But we're all sitting here writing about the same city, on the surface, the same city, but we've all got a different take on it. And it seems able to contain all these multitudinous versions of itself.
Yeah, I wrote a poem that said Edinburgh is a story. It feels much more a story than it is a place of lots of different stories. Okay, I think we had another question. Did we have you had a question? Yeah.
Where are you going?
Would you want to run through the mic? Who is? Am I now having to? Oh, you're not doing the mic anymore, are you? So yeah, right. Okay, let's go.
If you're an author, it's very hard to have a positive view of AI at the moment. Because AI is stealing all our ideas and stealing all our words and our stories. And there are books apparently out. I was having this conversation again last night. There are books out there that will pretend to be a Sara Sheridan book or an Ian Rankin book, but is actually written by AI, having studied all our works, and just put something together that reads like something we might have written in a fever dream. And so, and nobody's getting paid for this. There's no copyright issue. There's no, nobody's paying any attention to copyright. Nobody's paying any attention to intellectual property. They're just doing it because it's a Wild West show out there at the moment. But it has to be international. There's no point in doing it in the UK if anybody from Korea or anywhere else can just come and nick your stuff anyway. And as somebody said, a lot of the texts that are being used originally are bootleg copies anyway, or they're legal copies of the stories or the books to start with. So, at the moment, it's a minefield and a quagmire at the same time. And terrifying if you're a younger writer who's trying to establish yourself, and you could be up against AI. And you're trying to earn a living. You're trying to be recognized for the worth of your work. If it's worth it, then it's worth paying for it.
Not to come to its defense, but it reminds me a little bit, I suppose that thing, I wonder if, I'm not necessarily more positive about it, but I sometimes wonder, like, with any sort of technology, it's about people taking, not necessarily, we have to sort of embrace it because this is the world that's coming, so we have to find out ways of how can this be useful to us? So we need to obviously find ways to sort of control that, but to think about it, how it's useful. And I suppose at the same time when we thought everyone was going to be reading on Kindles, not reading on books. And actually what happens is actually people go, well, we're exciting. And then they go, actually, I kind of like a book, or I kind of like going to a bookshop. And I wonder if there'll be a point where you're going, well, no, it's great to read an AI chat GT, of Ian Rankin's books, but it's not quite Ian Rankin's book. So maybe there's a bit where that'll level itself out. And I think there's so many ways in which AI seems quite useful in terms of it's like, within like medicine and all these things that it can do lots of things for us, and it can be a useful tool for us. But I think it's about keeping it as a useful tool. But when we were talking earlier about what writers offer, I mean, what writers offer is imagination and going to the next thing. And it's the reason why, like scientists will often talk about, they'll be trying to get to the next bit of code, but it's sci-fi writers that will then go, well, actually, let's look at the moral or the ethical so I think we have a way of being able to maybe talk about what's the extreme of this or what can go wrong with this. But yeah, I definitely think this idea where your work's out there is all open source and used to teach robots is a sort of terrifying thing. But then, I don't know. I mean, I think there's probably got a long way to go till it settles itself and we actually see what it is. I feel like we're at the moment, like you said, in this Wild West. I don't know.
Yeah, it's about regulation. I mean, I agree. It's totally about regulation and how that gets regulated on a global basis. In terms of museum collections, the digitization of museum collections for me as a historical researcher is massive. And so there is that positive side to it. And also, you can't display everything in a museum. You go into the National Museum of Scotland, they've got hundreds of thousands of square feet, and they've got multiple amounts of the stuff that they could put on display there. So the idea of taking a relatively small space like the Writers' Museum and creating something that worked as a sort of virtual museum in there, that you could go in and call up anything in front of you in hologram form from the collections and get commentary and academic sort of comment on it. I think that's really exciting, and it changes. I remember when I was doing an event somewhere, this is a few years ago, and someone was talking about being able to access digital information for free. And everyone was like, well, why should information be free? The information should definitely be free, right? If it costs a certain amount of money to go down and research in, a particular institution. If you can do it from home, then that's knowledge sharing, and that's a totally different thing. So if we can direct that sort of AI and digital technology towards enabling people to learn or to study or whatever it is that they want to do, then that's amazing.
And I suppose with all these things, there's someone that gets then within that process becomes redundant. So in that process, what happens to the creator? Like suddenly if we can just become our own creators, then what happens to those people? So I think with all this technology, there's always somebody whose job or some skill that then has to adapt or so I think there's all these questions with technology, and I think it's always really important to kind of balance that out. But yeah, you're right. This idea that we can access the museum and create the thing that we want to see or the information that's important to us feels really revolutionary. That idea of kind of not having to rely upon the gatekeeper or the person that decides this is the thing you should learn or this is what's Scottish history or this is what
that you could go into the Writers' Museum and
create your own list.
Yeah, you could go with a list and say, I'd actually like to know about Lorna Moon, and put in Lorna Moon, and then suddenly there was a Lorna Moon exhibit. That's magic. That's amazing. So if it's used for technology is used for that purpose, rather than just having a permanent exhibition that you cannot change. But that, we're a wee way away from that, I would say.
You're becoming Lorna Moon's agent, don't you?
Yeah.
I hope you get 10% when she becomes huge.
I love Lorna Moon. I used to love Damon Runyon. He's an American short story writer, and he used to be my favourite short story writer because he's really funny and he writes about bookies and mafia guys, and it's all very and he's a brilliant short story writer, really, really good American kind of early 20th century. And then I read Lorna Moon and Damon was lost to me. It's like, I don't even care about Damon Runyon anymore. I only love Lorna.
Reminds me when I discovered Judy Blame. Yeah.
So I wrote a book called Where Are the Women, where I remapped Scotland according to women's history, and it totally activated me and enraged me because I discovered a whole load of people that I never heard of before during the course of the research for it. And afterwards, there was a whole load of writers that I never heard of, and some of them that I had. And I decided, right afterwards, I'm going to read all their stuff. And so I hadn't, Where the Women contains very short biographies. There's 1,200 women contained within the book. So I didn't do full research on everyone. I just was like, okay, this is the person. And then I read some of Lorna Moon's short stories, and I was like, Damien, get out of my head. Lorna, come on in.
Well, like your own exhibit going on in your head.
I should also say I'm an advocate for, like, Kathleen Raine is another one who Kirsten McQuarrie, who works for Phillips, which is the library organisation's writing about Kathleen Raine at the moment, who's an amazing poet, like fantastic poet, who fell in with Gavin Maxwell, Ring of Bright Water. And Ring of Bright Water was a line from one of Kathleen's poems that he nicked for his book as a title. And she's an extraordinary, talented, like her poetry is beautiful. And nobody has ever heard of Kathleen, and everybody's heard of Gavin. And that, it's like a tragedy. It's like these, are part of our voice, part of our cultural voice, part of our national canon is just missing. Mm-hmm. So yeah, maybe I have to take on Kathleen Raine in my agency as well.
Good.
Do we have any more questions?
Do you want me to? I do have an answer.
Start.
So I think largely on it, to be really frank, I think this starts in universities. I think that's where it starts. And there is, as Ian said, a kind of movement within universities. But universities are still very conformist. They remain conformist. They are institutions. And so I think there's still people missing in action, but that is where it starts. And it starts with somebody, professor in a university, thinking, I'm going to teach from this book in my course. Mm. That's where it starts from. So it's all really about education. We're right.
Well, also I think what's really exciting is if you look at the set texts and kind of in schools, like the higher Scottish set texts are a lot more kind of diverse than I remember them being. And I think feel like there is things changing. I think the canon is changing, but maybe it's about the idea that we just forget the idea of the canon. I mean, what's that about? I mean, it's something about going, challenging the idea of gatekeepers, or challenging the idea that this is what we should read and this is what determines, what we should learn about culture, or what this, I think that maybe there's something about exploding that.
There is, but it's also about what stays, what sticks. And so if you're teaching it in college and therefore it's going into, it's alive for people, the amount of people that are missing just because people stopped reading them or stopped talking about them is extraordinary. And as creative women, I mean, I've a couple of friends who are creatives a lot more famous than I am. And after Where the Women came out, their question was, how do we get remembered? And they might be selling millions of copies of their books. And I was like, build a library or an addition to a hospital, like put up a building. It's the only way to get remembered if you're not included in that canon. And if you are mainstream or writing commercial, you're unlikely to be included in that canon. That's the reality of it. It's still much more focused on literary work, not for guys, right? But for women or for anyone in any, women are the largest minority. So, deal with that one first. But for any kind of diversity, you're much more likely to get forgotten. That's the way of it.
I mean, it's certainly true that take, for example, the Edinburgh Book Festival, when it started out, you wouldn't get commercial fiction writers, you wouldn't get crime writers in there.
No, it's true.
And I remember when they actually started having they invited a few crime writers along, and suddenly they saw the size of the audience they were getting. And they went, oh, hang on a minute. And then slowly, all the literary festivals, your Cheltenham, your Hale whatever, start to have crime events. But it was, at first, I think 83, 85, when I went to the first Edinburgh Book Festivals, you would never have found a crime writer in there.
Yeah,
because it wasn't seen as being literature. And then things did start to change. Maybe the occasional lecturer would add a crime novel into their course. Or at high school, somebody would want to write an essay on a crime novel for their English higher or whatever. And slowly it did. And perhaps the types of books being written and published became more literary, became more literate, I don't know. But it certainly was. It did. I could see it change over the course of my professional career.
I think you're right. I think there's absolutely changes happening. What you're talking about is where romantic fiction is now. Romance novelists largely don't get invited to book festivals. So quite exciting this year. We had the first Edinburgh Women's Fiction Festival in Edinburgh, and that included romance authors that perhaps wouldn't get booked for the more kind of mainstream of book festival events. So you're right.
Biggest selling genre in the world.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of mental. So it's about that. I think it's about education, and it's not about where you are in your lifetime. It's about the hand down from that, and that's how you forget. going to say it again, Lorna Moon, Helen McInnes, all of these people get forgotten. They sell a lot in their time. D.E. Stevenson. Nobody was teaching Dorothy's books. Everyone was teaching Robert Louis' books. Robert Louis is venerated and remembered. Dorothy's disappeared. Sold multiple amounts of copies of her cousin, multiple, and she's nowhere. And that's partly because she wrote romance and books that would have been considered to be for women as well, apart from being, 40 million copies in. Sort of amazing. So if she'd endowed a library, there'd be the Dorothy Stevenson Library and we'd all be remembering her. It's the only way to do it is to get into the built architecture, the built landscape, the urban landscape if you can. And that's not the way it should be.
And again, when I'm outside Scotland doing book tours or whatever, and people say, "Oh, Edinburgh, that's Scotland Stevenson and that," or even Muriel Spark, and I go, "Yeah," and we've also got, and you start to list the authors who are actually living here: Maggie O'Farrell, living and writing in Edinburgh, and Kate Atkinson living and writing in Edinburgh, and
Ian Rankin
and Jenny Colgan living and writing in Edinburgh. But these are million-selling authors who quietly live in Edinburgh and are part of the Edinburgh scene, but are not.
Yeah.
People don't think of them as Scottish writers sometimes.
Yeah. So we're looking forward to the Jenny Colgan hospital wing.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Can we take another question?
I mean, there are quite a lot of magazines.
Yeah,
I think Gutter's really great.
Gutter's
magazine.
great.
Yeah, I mean, they don't sell in the quantities those sold in because there's a lot of competition these days, and also print journalism. I mean, it's expensive and it doesn't make people any money, so it's tending to move online if it's going anywhere. I think the literary journal is almost an online thing now, in terms of people's, people reading it. I think Substack and stuff like that could be the next thing to go in that direction. But yeah, I mean, when I was in Edinburgh, we had Ken Crastus, we had Edinburgh Review, New Edinburgh Review was still going. Lots of very small, Clan Jamfrey, lots of very small magazines that came and went, and some of them stuck around. Chapman has kind of stuck around despite everything, although it doesn't make any money. But I mean, it's a stepping stone or a rung of the ladder. If you're a young writer, if you're a new writer, you need somebody to look at your work and maybe publish your work to give you the confidence to keep going. And all these little magazines were hugely important and are hugely important.
And I think also that a lot of these magazines are folding because they're not getting public funding. So yeah. I think it really is important to have these magazines, but they're not a commercial endeavor, so they have to be supported by kind of public funding, and that's obviously, as we all know, more and more difficult to get. So I think that's probably one of definitely. I think Gutter's a really good representation of where Scottish literature is at. If you can subscribe to that one. Should be a little plug there. But yeah, I think there's a good question.
Well, what a lot of people probably don't realise is that Ian and I shared a school and an English teacher. Ian was obviously way ahead of me a few years.
Obviously.
But yeah, so I think that sort of Ian lived in Cardenden, which was a bit more exotic. I was brought up in Cowdenbeath, went to Beath High School. And when I went to Beath High School, it wasn't really the norm to go to university, so you had to really sort of set yourself apart. I had another teacher. I don't know if you remember Miss Tennant at Beath High. She was another teacher of English. Well, she introduced me to Sunset Song and Lewis Grassic Gibbon, and I think that was a really defining moment for me. I thought I just want to take this further, so really sort of stuck in, managed to go to Glasgow University and study Scotland and history. That path brought me here, and this was my first adult job to come to Edinburgh museums and galleries, and I've been here for 29 years, and it's been an absolute privilege to sort of see so many exhibitions at City Arts Centre and the Writers' Museum. It's a fantastic place to work, great team, and I think really that was my defining moment, again from Beath High School.
Just shows you how important teachers are, aren't there?
Yeah.
I mean, I am a lot older than you. But when I was at school, there was a teacher called Mr. Gillespie, Ron Gillespie.
Yeah, Ron.
Who was Glaswegian. And when we were 18, we were in the last year at high school, he would take us to the pub after school. And we would sit and talk about, and this guy knew Greek, he knew Latin, he thought of Bob Dylan's lyrics as being poetry. He was very young and energetic and exciting. And we would sit and talk about T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound and all that kind of stuff. And he, I've often name-checked him down the years as being I hope he's still with us.
He is. Actually, he, believe it or not, he seemed ancient when I was at school, and he only retired a few years ago. I think teachers always seem a lot older when you're at school. But yeah, he definitely is still around, because I'm on a Facebook page for Beath High, and people have seen him around Dunfermline recently.
Spotted Mr. Gillespie.
I'm going to go and stalk him now. I'm going to get on Facebook and I'm going to stalk my old English teacher.
I love that.
When I was in first year at uni, I stayed in Tollcross and used to go into Bennett's Bar. And one night I was in Bennett's Bar sitting with a flatmate of mine. And I said, oh my God, that's Norman McCaig standing at the bar. He said, go and talk to him. You're a poet, Ian. You write poetry. Go and talk to this guy. I went, I can't talk to him. And so he marched over and said, oh, Mr. McCaig, can we buy you a whiskey? And Norman McCaig said, oh, lovely. Over he came, we plied him with whiskey. He sat for hours chatting to us. And that was wonderful to think that poets were not people up on Mount Parnassus. They were pretty much just like you and me. You know, they were approachable and they were chatty. And
only if you buy them a drink, just to...
Well, that
come with gifts.
That's what the book festival does. That's what the book festival does. Like the book festival brings, and particularly, they have a huge outreach program now all over the place. It brings people that maybe wouldn't come to the book festival, brings the book festival to them, and it makes those people or that career or that connection possible. It's really important. I mean,
that's why I go back to Beath. I'm going back to Beath next week, actually. I go back to Beath High School quite a lot to talk to the kids just about, don't feel that writers are different from you or weird or from a different class or anything. If you feel like writing, get writing.
Yeah, you are writers.
Yeah, absolutely. And the same goes for homeless people in Edinburgh. It's a great project that meets at St. Patrick's Square. Street reads, and they've got a library there, and homeless people drop in, and I do writers' workshops there. And some of the writing is amazing that you get from homeless folk. They've got as active an imagination as anybody else.
There's one of them that's written a fantasy book that I downloaded on my Kindle. He's self-published his fantasy book, and it's great.
Yeah.
That's also the idea about, as well as that idea that anyone can write, as well as anyone can read. And I was thinking when you were talking about the idea of the canon and what books get celebrated, for me it's always about you also at the same time celebrating the reader. So these books that are big commercial hits that then get derided of not being any worthy, it's actually at the same time what you're really doing is you're saying that those readers aren't proper readers as well. And I always feel that that's really quite a big thing about that idea about anyone can read and celebrating every type of reader feels really important.
I had an uncle who worked on the Lochgelly Times newspaper when I was a wee kid, and my parents were a bit embarrassed about how many comics I read. And they said to my uncle, I wish he would read something a bit more serious. And my uncle said, it doesn't matter what Ian reads as long as he's reading. And those comics sparked my imagination, and they took me to the next thing, which was books or poetry or song lyrics or whatever. But it all started with D.C. Thompson.
Yeah, and they teach you narrative drive.
Yeah.
Comics is storyboarding.
And they were affordable literacy.
Yeah.
And a lot of them have disappeared now. You go into a shop now, and the range of comics is much narrower, and it's mostly tie-ins with product.
Yeah.
Rather than anything that's actually been written from in a very creative way. So I think that rung of the ladder is gone now.
It's like there's wonderful graphic novels. I think like
like manga stuff.
There's a lot of really, for me, as a mum and a former teacher, I think there's some fantastic work for the YA is so exciting. That whole kind of.
And a lot of it's still coming out of Scotland. I mean, a lot of the most successful comics writers and illustrators are either Scottish-based or they started life here.
And also the other thing that I was thinking about, doing story, if you think about storytelling and accessing stories, like games. Yeah. Like the complexity of the stories and games is it's something, again, that we don't value.
Yeah, it's narrative.
And kids know that. They know that really well. And so they're, if we've got one time for one more question, I think.
Before it gets too dark.
That'll be it. Before to get the candles out. No?
We're
No.
done.
It's a very Edinburgh audience, isn't it? That's it. Well done. You've done very well. Oh, there we go.
Uh-oh,
Look at that.
That's mucked up your filming.
Now we can
Yeah,
see it.
you
Now
guys
we can
are
see
stuffing
it.
out.
Mucked up your
Well,
filming.
maybe what we do is just do a big round of applause for Margaret for organising such a beautiful and wonderful
Yes.
event, and to Ian and Sara. And to the wonderful Ian and Sara for being so interesting and chatty. I don't know, now I'm being an English teacher, I'm giving you like a little mini report. So, yeah, well done. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hannah.